Take a moment to read Unit 6, Lesson 12, Problem 1, Parallel and Perpendicular. In this activity, students are practicing writing equations for lines parallel and perpendicular to the given line. Previously, students have learned about the characteristics that are required if two lines are parallel or perpendicular to a line. There are multiple ways that students could find the slope of the line on the graph. They could use the equation for slope, or they could count the change in y over the change in x, also known as rise over run. In this video, I will be counting the slope. Before we do that, let's identify the characteristics that are required to have parallel and perpendicular lines. So we know that two lines are parallel if they have slopes that are equal to each other. If they are perpendicular, two things actually have to happen. They have to be opposite reciprocal slopes. You may be wondering, what does it mean to be an opposite reciprocal? So when it talks about opposite, I always like to think of a number line. If I'm talking about the number -4, the opposite of that is +4, or vice versa. If I have +4, the opposite is -4. So one must be positive, one must be negative when they're opposites. Reciprocal is talking about the values. So again, if I will go back to the number 4, right, my reciprocal would be 1/4. Okay, some people notice that it's really just, or they say that it's flipping your fraction. Okay, so reciprocal means that if it's 4, you're going to change it to 1/4. One other thing that students have been practicing is using point slope form. So point slope form means that if they give you a point to go through and you know the slope, you can write the equation of the line. There are many ways to write the equations. This is just the most efficient way at this point to write it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the actual problem. So again, if I look, problem number 1 says I want a line that's perpendicular to n. And part 2 says, give me one that's parallel to n. So before I can do any of this, I must figure out the slope of n so that I know how to answer these questions. So let's go ahead and figure out the slope. And as I said, I am going to be using counting techniques. So when you're counting, it does not matter which point you start at on the line. Just make sure that you are using only vertical and horizontal lines to create a connection between those 2 points. Okay, so notice how I didn't go off to the side. I went horizontal and vertical. Now, when we count, we have to remember it's the change in y is our numerator. So our change in y is how far we rise. So in this case, so rise. So notice that this time I count up 2 spaces. So that's going to be my numerator. Notice it has to be a positive because when I go up on a graph, those are, bigger values. Okay, to get my run or my change in y, this time I have to count to the left because I stopped right here at this point. So I have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 spaces to the left. So when I go to the left, notice that my numbers are getting smaller. So I'm going to say that this is -5. Now, when you divide a positive and negative number, you do get a negative. So a lot of times we will rewrite this to be -2/5 and not have the negative in either the top or bottom, just out in front of it. So let's take a look at question number 1. Question number 1 says, write an equation of a line that's perpendicular to n and whose y-intercept is at 0, 5. What we need to do for this is we are going to use this point slope form. So I am going to first identify my h and k because h and k just represents the point they told me to go through. So they told me to go through the point 0, 5. The second thing I want to do is I want to figure out what is my slope. Well, when a slope is perpendicular to n, remember we said two things have to happen. The first thing is it has to be the opposite. So instead of being negative 2/5, it has to be a positive number. The second thing is it has to be the reciprocal. So instead of being 2/5, it needs to be 5/2. Okay, so we know our slope for this one. Okay, I'm gonna color code a little just because it helps my brain figure out where am I supposed to put each of these numbers. So I see the number 0 has to go in for the letter H, and right here is where H is. So I'm gonna replace that with 0 in just a minute. And I can see K here is 5. So I'm gonna come down here to where K is. I'm gonna eventually change that to a 5. And then my M is gonna be 5/2. So let's go ahead and write the equation. So I'm going to replace each one of these numbers that I have color coded. So I don't have a color for y, so I'm going to leave it y minus. Then it says my green, which I highlighted as the number 5, equals my blue, which happens to be 5/2. And then I need a parenthesis, x minus, and then it says do your orange number. Okay, notice that this is my equation. There are a few things that if there were a multiple choice test, they might not have the -0 because when I subtract 0 from something, it is not going to change the value. So please note that if this were a multiple choice test, they might write it just like this. But again, in this equation, the teacher should give you credit because it just asks you to write an equation. It doesn't tell you what form it has to be in. All right, let's take a look at part 2. Part 2 says, hey, write us an equation for the line that is parallel to n, and that goes through the point 3, 1. So again, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to label my point as HK, and now I'm going to figure out my slope. Well, in this case, my slope that's parallel, remember that parallel has to be the same slope as the original. So my original slope was -2/5, so that does have to be my slope here. Again, just like I did before, I'm going to go ahead and box in some of these values. So I see that K, I'm going to have to put in 1. I'm going to have -2/5. Oops, I did not mean to do that one. Wrong color. Okay, H has to be 3, and then I'll highlight my blue as -2/5. All right, so let's go back and let's write our equation. So I'm going to have y minus, my K is 1, equals, my slope is -2/5, parenthesis x minus 3 is my h. Again, you could just leave the equation like this because it does not tell you to put it into another form.